Madonna Thunderhawk Native organizing before the nonprofit industrial complex. I am a veteran of the Red Power movement of the 1960s and 70s. I was part of the American Indian movement and am a co-founder of Women of All Red Nations. I was involved in several major actions, including the occupation of Alcatraz, the Trail of Broken Treaties, and Wounded Knee. AIM was formed in 1968 by urban Indians, many of whom also came out of correctional facilities. AIM patterned itself upon the self-defense model of Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale's Black Panther Party. AIM patrols monitor the streets of Minnesota's Twin Cities, documenting and confronting police brutality against Native people. Chapters sprang up through the country. The Native people of the Bay Area also took cues from the Black Panthers, especially the 19 Indian people who became the Indians of all tribes and took over Alcatraz in an effort to turn it into an Indian cultural center. Several hundred Indian people joined them, and many non-Indian groups like the Black Panthers lent their support over a period of 2 years. The events at Alcatraz inspired subsequent takeovers of federal property and even more militant direct action. When one of the leaders of the Alcatraz takeover, Richard Oakes, was killed in 1972, Native groups, spearheaded by AIM, organized a caravan to Washington, D.C., where they attempted a 20-point treaty renegotiation program with the U.S. government. As we traveled cross-country to Washington, more and more reservation and urban-based Indian people joined our caravan. By the time we got to Washington, most of the Indians participating were reservation-based. At this event, we ended up taking over the Bureau of Indian Affairs building. In 1973, the Pine Ridge Reservation erupted into conflict when AIM took over Wounded Knee in protest of Tribal Chair Dick Wilson in conjunction with the anti-Wilson community members of Pine Ridge. I participated in all of these events. Because we were dedicated Indian freedom fighters, the Federal Bureau of Investigation started targeting the men of AIM. The women of AIM then realized that we could just about do anything under the eyes of the feds and the press because we were invisible. So we organized ourselves as WARN in 1978. 102 The revolution will not be funded. We organized around many issues, including environmental contamination in Indian country and sterilization abuse against Native women. Our goal was to fight for Indian sovereignty and self-determination. We were dealing with the policies of genocide committed by the U.S. government, so our goal was not to assimilate into the U.S. Consequently, we did not try to become part of any funding establishment, as that would have made our work less radical. We were very dedicated to fighting for freedom for our people. When we first started organizing, we were rookies. We did not know how to organize but learned as we went along. Today, when young people ask me about my days in AIM and what they could do now, their first question is this: where will we get the money? Often they are surprised by my response. But back then, we did not focus on fundraising. We organized first, and then figured out how to make it happen. And we seem to get a lot more done than what people with funding and nonprofits are getting done now. One reason is that organizations today often have to spend so much time raising money for salaries, sending in reports, and schmoozing with funders that they spend more time on fundraising and administration than they do on organizing. In contrast, we put all of our effort into organizing and activism. Generally, we in AIM and WARN operated on donations. We organized speaking tours and used the honoraria to support our movement. Churches, universities, and non-Indian organizations supported us. Many lawyers, law students, and others with technical expertise volunteered their time, especially during the Wounded Knee trials. We relied on in-kind donations and were creative with our resources. We also did not travel with the same expectation of comfort as many of today's activists have. Nowadays, if people go to a conference, they often expect to stay at a hotel, while back in the day, we might camp out or stay in people's homes. For instance, Native communities and reservations and cities would invite us in to support them on various issues. So we might call a church in the town where we were and say, "We have 50 cars going to, say, a town in Nebraska. How can you support us?" The church would usually wire us money or give us supplies. They would also call church groups in the area where we were traveling to and ask them to find us a place to stay. Like others, I traveled with my children, and people would make sure we had diapers and other necessities. During that time, even mainline churches supported our work since they were focusing on race relations. Young people would save up their money or get part-time jobs and volunteer their time for the movement. Some people would come and work with us for a week. Others might stay for a year. I remember one woman who helped out with the Black Hills Alliance during the day and played piano for a fancy restaurant in Rapid City during the evening. We also shared resources communally so that those people who had money shared resources with those who did not, as to the Indian communities we visited. In addition, we developed links with support groups in cities who had more resources they would share with us. Also, back in those days, we did not organize on the basis of single issues. Today, you have groups that, say, only work on peace issues or only work on violence issues. They won't support your work if it is not specifically part of their mission statement. Back then, organizations were more focused on radical social transformation, so collaborations were more frequent. Activists helped each other out regardless of the issue. If we had a pressing issue, other folks would drop what they were working on to support us, and vice versa. For instance, many Black Power organizations supported us in Wounded Knee, and I was active in supporting the farm worker struggles. One of Warren's big projects was a water study in the Pine Ridge Reservation. We were one of the first groups to identify the issue of environmental racism. We began this study when Lorelei Decora mentioned to me that there were so many women having spontaneous abortions in the hospital where she worked that they had to put beds in the hallways. Meanwhile, I was working with the survival school and had noticed that people were not really feeling well. It seemed like everyone was always sick with various ailments. After comparing notes, we began to suspect a larger problem, possibly air pollution from the nearby gunnery range, or maybe that there's something wrong with the water. Certainly, we knew a lot about contamination's devastating effects on our communities. Warren had been a founding member of the Black Hills Alliance, which had shut down some of the uranium mining in the Black Hills. The uranium mining conducted in Black Hills could very well have contaminated the Pine Ridge Reservation, which is just southeast of the Black Hills. So we decided to take action. We took water samples on Pine Ridge and then samples from the Cheyenne River Reservation as a control group in 1979. We had the samples tested at the School of Mines in Rapid City, South Dakota. High levels of radioactive contamination were found in the Pine Ridge Reservation samples compared with the control samples from the Cheyenne River Reservation. Our report showed that in 1 month in 1979, 38% of pregnancies reported to the Public Health Service Hospital in Pine Ridge resulted in spontaneous abortions and excessive bleeding. Of the children born, 60 to 70% paid to NV. Offits and Pending with the evaism. Reganize. He and Nazaticus. Many airtime missions and the expectable go to A, we might de-invite us town where Al can you plies. They too in S5. I traveled other Nesesk since the ND Volunteer 104. The revolution will not be funded suffered breathing complications as a result of underdeveloped lungs and or jaundice. Children were born with cleft palates, club feet diseases uncommon to the Dakota people. Pine Ridge Reservation lies southeast of Black Hills, the site of extensive uranium drilling and mining from the late 1940s to the early 70s at first. Both the Center for Disease Control and Indian Health Services condemned us and declared our study was invalid. But later, when they learned that the School of Mines supported our claims, they decided to conduct their own study. What they found were even higher levels of contamination in some areas of the Pine Ridge Reservation. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission raised the level of what is considered acceptable contamination, however, instead of attempting to eliminate water contamination. In one area, Indian Health Services started providing bottled water when the water became so contaminated it was visible. After almost 20 years of our organizing, the U.S. Congress finally authorized a new water pipeline in 2003, but the funding for it was halted as resources were diverted to support the Bush administration's war on terror. So the struggle against environmental racism continues, but at least our efforts have helped raise awareness about environmental racism in Indian country. How we organized was different from how activists tend to respond now. We didn't wait for permission from anyone. We didn't have people tell us, this is too big of a project for you to do. You should contact the state or some other governing power first. Nowadays, An organization might want to do something more creative, but its board of directors will tell them no. We didn't have a board since we weren't formally organized, so we could just proceed with what we thought was best. We did not worry if our work would upset funders. We just worried about whether the work would help our communities. And we decided to do the study ourselves to ensure the results would be accurate. Today, when the same issue regarding nuclear contamination happens, most people go to an Indian Health Services or county commission meeting and ask them to do something instead of doing something themselves. These bodies then don't do anything, and the people just go back home and complain. I have seen this happen where ranchers complained to a commission about water contamination near an Air Force base. They went to a city council meeting with water samples and then did nothing else. Warren had tax-exempt status once, but we let it lapse. It was too complicated. No one wanted to sit in the office and write reports with time and energy that could be used to advance our movement. We also had security concerns with COINTLPRO, so we were careful about being too organized. We did not want to have membership lists and chapters. We learned that the FBI would fabricate information, so we were a loose-knit group. If women in Cleveland wanted to organize, they could be autonomous and be worn. Once you get too structured, your whole scope changes from activism to maintaining an organization and getting paid. When we first heard about nonprofits in the late 1970s and early 80s, it seemed like a good thing. We did not necessarily see what might happen if we started pursuing our work through nonprofits. Instead, nonprofits seemed to be just another way to raise money. But over the years, it has changed the scope of activism so that nonprofits are just part of the system. The focus turned to raising money to keep the organization going, while the actual work of activism became secondary and watered down. And when the money disappeared, the work did too. Before, we focused on how to organize to make change, but now most people will only work within funding parameters. People work for a salary rather than because they are passionate about an issue. In Native communities, the economy is so bad that people just need jobs. So they might work for a nonprofit primarily because they need the income, but they do not have the motivation to really push the issue. Of course, not everyone in a nonprofit is like that. Many people in nonprofits really try to do good work. But the point is, when you start paying people to do activism, you can start to attract people to the work who are not primarily motivated by or dedicated to the struggle. In addition, getting paid to do the work can also change those of us who are dedicated. Before we know it, we start to expect to be paid and do less unpaid work than we would have before. This way of organizing benefits the system, of course, because people start seeing organizing as a career rather than as involvement in a social movement that requires sacrifice. As a result, organizing is not as effective. For example, we first started organizing around diabetes by analyzing the effects of government commodities on our health. Indian communities were given unhealthy foods by the government in exchange for our having been relocated from our lands, where we engaged in subsistence living, and now damming and other forms of environmental destruction impact our ability to be self-sustaining. Today you can get a federal grant to work on diabetes prevention, but rather than get the community to organize around the politics of diabetes, people just sit in an office all day and design pamphlets. Activism is relegated to events. Many people will get involved for an event, but avoid rocking the boat on an ongoing basis because if they do, they might lose their funding. For instance, if the government is funding the pamphlet, then an organization is not going to address the impact of U.S. colonialism on native diets because they don't want to lose funding. People in nonprofits are not necessarily consciously thinking that they are selling out, but just by trying to keep funding and pay everyone's salaries, they start to unconsciously limit their imagination of what they could do. In addition, the nonprofit structure supports a paternalistic relationship in which nonprofits from outside our communities fund their own handpicked organizers, rather than funding us to do the work ourselves. Today, the Bush administration is wreaking havoc on environmental protect, step tie-in, but where is the big outcry? People are too busy building organizations. So proj, and who is left to do the work? People are also very narrow in their scope of work. Previously, organizers would lay down their issue when necessary and support another issue. Now, most organizers are very specialized and cannot do anything unless they have a budget first. More, foundations will often expect organizations to be very specialized and won't fund work that is outside their funding priorities. This reality can limit an organization's ability to be creative and flexible as things fun see change in our society. Of course, when we did our work as Warren, we also go TCO and crushed by the FBI and CONTLPRO, so it can be understandable that people are reluctant to think in terms of more radical organizing approaches. Also, nonprofits have so changed the culture of organizing that we would have to why we change that culture now to do organizing different. Why? It is also true that in and computer age, it feels like we do need more expensive equipment to do work we didn't need before. Maybe when we start paying $8 a gallon for gas, people foo start being activists again, because we won't have a COIC. Activism is tough. It is not for people interested in building a carrier, H0 no TE1 at the end of the BIA takeover. I am negotiated with the US government to leave without arrest us. However, this takeover served to harden differences between AIM leaders and many more conservative tribal government leaders. These differences further conflicts between tribal and AIM leaders on the Pine Ridge Reservation, contributing to the Wounded Knee massacre.